At 7:30 a.m. on December 13, 1937, Dr. Robert Wilson stood in the operating theater of Nanking University Hospital, his hands already covered in blood, looking at a surgical schedule that listed 12 operations. Behind him, through the hospital windows, he could see smoke rising from dozens of fires across the city. Japanese troops were entering Nanking. The Chinese army had fled, and 250,000 civilians had nowhere to run. Wilson had no way of knowing that over the next 6 weeks, he would perform surgery for 20 hours a day, every day, without rest. That he would operate on women who had been raped with bayonets, on children who had been used for bayonet practice, on men whose bodies had been mutilated for entertainment. That he would document the worst war crime of the Second Sino-Japanese War. That 300,000 people would die while he tried to save them one at a time. And that his testimony would be ignored for 50 years because the world wasn't ready to believe what Japan had done. Nanking was the capital of nationalist China, a city of over 600,000 people situated on the Yangtze River. By December 1937, it had become the final obstacle between the advancing Japanese army and total control of eastern China. The battle for Nanking had been brief and one-sided. Chinese defenses collapsed within days. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek evacuated the government to Chongqing on December 7th, leaving the city under the command of General Tang Shengzhai, who was ordered to defend Nanking to the last man. Tang had 90,000 troops, poorly equipped, inadequately trained, already demoralized by months of retreating before the Japanese advance. They faced 200,000 Japanese soldiers backed by artillery, tanks, and air support. The outcome was never in doubt. On December 12th, Tang abandoned his troops and fled across the Yangtze River. The Chinese army disintegrated. Soldiers threw away their weapons and uniforms, trying to blend in with the civilian population. Others attempted to swim across the Yangtze to escape. Most drowned. The river filled with bodies. By December 13th, Japanese forces entered an essentially undefended city containing approximately 250,000 civilians, the 600,000 population reduced by evacuations. But still more people than could possibly escape. International observers in Nanking, missionaries, doctors, journalists, businessmen, had established a safety zone in the center of the city. A 3.86 square mile area declared neutral territory where civilians could shelter. The zone was modeled after similar safe areas that had been established during the Spanish Civil War. The International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone was led by John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member who used his status to negotiate with Japanese commanders. The committee believed that international law would protect the zone, that Japanese forces would respect neutral territory. They were catastrophically wrong. Dr. Robert Wilson was a 36-year-old American surgeon who had been working at Nanking University Hospital since 1936. He was one of a handful of Western doctors who had chosen to remain in Nanking when the Japanese army approached. His colleagues had evacuated. His wife and children had left for safety weeks earlier. Wilson stayed because someone needed to provide medical care for the civilians who couldn't escape. On the morning of December 13th, he performed his first surgery of the day, repairing a shrapnel wound in a Chinese soldier's abdomen. The procedure took 2 hours. When he finished, his nurses informed him that Japanese soldiers were at the hospital gates. Wilson walked outside to find a Japanese officer demanding entry to search for Chinese soldiers hiding in the hospital. Wilson explained that the hospital was protected under international law, that it was neutral territory treating civilians and wounded. The officer ignored him and ordered troops to search the building. They found 43 wounded Chinese soldiers in the wards. The soldiers were unarmed, incapacitated by their injuries, clearly non-combatants under international law. The Japanese troops dragged them outside and executed all of them with bayonets in the hospital courtyard while Wilson and his staff watched. This was how it began. Over the next 6 weeks, Japanese forces committed systematic atrocities in Nanking on a scale that defied comprehension. Mass executions, systematic rape, torture, mutilation. Murder as entertainment. The Japanese army had been fighting in China for 6 months. They had taken casualties. They were exhausted, angry, and their commanders had lost control of discipline. When they entered Nanking, they were given implicit permission to do whatever they wanted. What they wanted was revenge. The executions began immediately. Japanese troops rounded up military-age males, anyone who looked like they might have been a soldier. They were marched to execution sites along the Yangtze River, forced to dig mass graves, then machine-gunned. Some execution sites killed hundreds at a time. Others killed thousands. The bodies were pushed into the river or buried in mass graves that were hastily covered with dirt. But the executions weren't limited to military-age males. Elderly men were killed. Teenagers were killed. Boys as young as 12 were killed because they were tall enough to carry a rifle. The criteria kept expanding. Anyone who had a callus on their hand from holding a weapon, executed. Anyone who had a short haircut typical of soldiers, executed. Anyone who looked at a Japanese soldier wrong, executed. Dr. Wilson received his first civilian casualty at 2:00 p.m. on December 13th. A man in his 50s with a bayonet wound through his abdomen. The blade had perforated his intestines in multiple places. Wilson operated for 3 hours, repairing the damage, closing the wounds. The man survived the surgery but died 2 days later from infection. There were no antibiotics. There was nothing Wilson could do. That same afternoon, he received 8 more patients with bayonet wounds, then 12 more, then 20. The hospital was being overwhelmed. By December 14th, the pattern of injuries changed. Wilson began seeing women. The first was a teenager, maybe 16 years old, brought in by her mother. She had been raped by multiple Japanese soldiers, then stabbed in the genitals with a bayonet when they were done. Wilson performed emergency surgery to stop the bleeding, to repair the internal damage. He saved her life. She would never fully recover. Over the next 6 weeks, Wilson would perform surgery on hundreds of rape victims. The injuries were beyond anything in medical literature. Women raped with bayonets. Women with objects, bottles, sticks, rifle barrels, forced inside them until they ruptured internally. Pregnant women whose fetuses had been cut out. The youngest victim Wilson treated was 7 years old. The oldest was 76. Japanese soldiers were raping women systematically, gang rapes involving dozens of men, often killing the victims afterward. Sometimes they raped women in front of their families, forcing fathers and sons to watch before killing them too. The rapes weren't random violence. They were organized. Officers established comfort stations, buildings where Chinese women were held as sex slaves for Japanese troops. Women were kidnapped from their homes and forced into these stations where they would be raped 30, 40, 50 times a day. Women who resisted were tortured. Women who became pregnant were killed. Women who contracted venereal diseases were killed. The International Committee documented over 20,000 cases of rape in the first month. The actual number was certainly higher. Most victims never reported the attacks. Dr. Wilson wrote in his diary on December 18, 1937, "The slaughter of civilians is appalling." I could go on for pages telling of cases of rape and brutality, almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted corpses are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in without warning or reason and killed 5 of their number. and wounded the two that found their way to the hospital. Wilson was operating 18-20 hours a day. He would finish one surgery, scrub out, and immediately begin the next. His operating theater ran continuously. When he had to sleep, he slept on a cot in the hospital for 2 or 3 hours, then went back to surgery. His surgical records from this period document nightmare after nightmare. December 15th. Man, approximately 40 years old, multiple bayonet wounds to chest and abdomen. Died on operating table. December 16th. Woman, approximately 25 years old, raped, then stabbed in vagina with bayonet, severe internal bleeding. Survived surgery but prognosis poor. December 18th. Boy, approximately 10 years old, right arm nearly severed by sword strike. Amputation necessary. December 19th. Man shot in both legs for refusing to reveal location of his daughters. Bullets shattered both femurs. Limited morphine available. The diary entries continued day after day, documenting injuries that revealed the systematic nature of the violence. Japanese soldiers weren't just killing. They were entertaining themselves. They held killing contests, competitions to see who could behead the most Chinese civilians. Japanese newspapers reported on these contests like sporting events. One article from the Tokyo Nikkei Shimbun newspaper described a contest between two officers to see who could kill 100 people first using only a sword. The contest ended in a tie at 106-105, so they extended it to 150. This was published in a Japanese newspaper, celebrated as an example of martial prowess. Wilson saw the results. Headless bodies brought to the hospital. Sometimes the families would arrive carrying the severed heads, begging Wilson to reattach them, unable to accept that death was irreversible. Japanese soldiers also used Chinese civilians for bayonet practice. They would tie prisoners to poles and practice thrusting techniques. New recruits were forced to participate as part of their training, desensitizing them to killing. Wilson treated survivors who had been used as practice targets. Most didn't survive long. Bayonet wounds to major organs rarely did in 1937, with limited medical resources. The murders became increasingly sadistic. Japanese soldiers buried people alive. They doused civilians with gasoline and burned them. They held children by the legs and smashed their heads against walls. They forced sons to rape their mothers at gunpoint, then killed both. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns documented by multiple witnesses across the city. John Rabe, the Nazi Party member who led the International Committee, was so horrified by what he witnessed that he wrote directly to Hitler, begging the Führer to intervene with Germany's Japanese allies to stop the atrocities. Hitler ignored the letter. Rabe's diary from this period describes finding a family that had been killed in their home, the father beheaded, the mother raped and bayoneted, the children crushed with rifle butts. He found them because neighbors reported screaming that had lasted for hours before stopping. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary who ran a school for girls in the safety zone, documented Japanese soldiers climbing the walls of the school to kidnap young women. She would physically block the soldiers, arguing with them, sometimes successfully preventing abductions. She saved hundreds of women this way. The ones she couldn't save haunted her for the rest of her life. Vautrin's diary entry from December 16, 1937. Today, I watched Japanese soldiers drag away 3 girls from the elementary school. They were 11, 12, and 13 years old. I tried to stop them. They pushed me aside. I could hear the girls screaming as they were taken to the barracks. They were returned 3 hours later. One could not walk, another was bleeding, the third was silent. They stared at nothing. The safety zone that was supposed to protect civilians became a hunting ground. Japanese soldiers entered at will, dragging away women for rape, killing anyone who resisted. The International Committee filed complaint after complaint with Japanese military command. The complaints were ignored. Officers either claimed ignorance of the atrocities or stated that discipline of Japanese soldiers was an internal military matter. Some Japanese officers tried to stop the violence. There are documented cases of officers executing their own soldiers for committing atrocities or ordering units to cease attacks on civilians. But these were exceptions. The overwhelming majority of Japanese officers either participated in the atrocities or tacitly approved them by doing nothing. By late December, Dr. Wilson was operating on patients in triage conditions. So many wounded arriving that he had to choose who to save and who to let die. A man with a survivable gunshot wound would be prioritized over a man with bayonet wounds to major organs. A young woman had better chances of survival than an elderly man. Children were prioritized when possible, but children with severe injuries often died anyway despite Wilson's best efforts. He was making life and death decisions every hour, knowing that people he didn't operate on would die in the hallways waiting for treatment that would never come. His morphine supplies ran out in late December. After that, he performed surgery with patients conscious, screaming in pain, held down by nurses while Wilson cut into them. He wrote on December 28th, "Operated today on a boy of 14 whose abdomen had been sliced open by a bayonet. No anesthetic available. He was brave. He screamed only twice before losing consciousness. I don't know if he will survive the night. I don't know if I care anymore. I am numb to it. That terrifies me more than the blood." Wilson's psychological state was deteriorating. He was witnessing horrors 20 hours a day with no relief, no support, no end in sight. He couldn't process what he was seeing. The scale of cruelty exceeded anything human psychology was designed to handle. He continued anyway because stopping meant people died. By early January 1938, the mass killings had decreased, but the rapes continued. Japanese forces had established administrative control over Nanking. The chaos of the initial invasion had settled into organized occupation, but organized occupation didn't mean the violence stopped. It meant the violence became systematic. The comfort stations were operating full-time now, hundreds of women held as sex slaves. Japanese military police would raid neighborhoods, round up women aged 12-35, and force them into the stations. Families hid their daughters. They cut their hair short and dressed them as boys. They rubbed charcoal on their faces to make them look dirty and unattractive. Some families killed their own daughters rather than let them be taken. Dr. Wilson received patients who had escaped from comfort stations. The injuries were horrific: vaginal tearing, internal bleeding, venereal diseases in advanced stages. Many had been raped so many times their bodies had simply broken down. Wilson treated them as best he could, but there was no treatment for the psychological damage. These women had been destroyed in ways that couldn't be repaired with surgery. Minnie Vautrin recorded in January 1938 that several women who had escaped from comfort stations committed suicide in her school. They couldn't live with what had been done to them. They drowned themselves in wells or hanged themselves in their rooms. Vautrin tried to counsel them to give them hope. She failed. The damage was too severe. By February 1938, the acute phase of the Nanking Massacre was over. The mass executions had stopped. The systematic rapes continued, but at a reduced intensity. Japanese military command had imposed some discipline on troops, though enforcement was sporadic. The death toll was staggering. The International Committee estimated 40,000 deaths in the first 6 weeks. Chinese government sources claimed 300,000. Japanese sources acknowledged 20,000, mostly combatants. Modern historians generally accept 200,000 deaths as the most likely range, though precise numbers are impossible to determine. Mass graves were never properly excavated. Bodies were burned or thrown in the Yangtze River. Records were destroyed or never kept. What is certain? This was one of the worst war crimes of the 20th century, comparable in scope to the Holocaust or the Armenian Genocide. Dr. Wilson had performed over 600 surgeries in 6 weeks. He had saved hundreds of lives. He had watched thousands die. In March 1938, he wrote a letter to his family. "I cannot describe what I have witnessed. When I try to write it down, the words seem inadequate. How do you explain to someone who has never seen it that human beings are capable of such cruelty? That soldiers raped children in front of their mothers, then killed both for entertainment? That I operated on a pregnant woman whose fetus had been cut out while she was still alive?" The words exist, but they cannot convey the reality. Wilson remained in Nanking until 1940, continuing to treat victims of Japanese occupation. When he finally left China, he carried his surgical records and his diary, documentation of what had happened. He believed the world needed to know. He believed that revealing the truth would bring justice. He was wrong. After the war ended in 1945, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East was convened to prosecute Japanese war crimes. The tribunal heard testimony about the Nanking Massacre from Wilson, Rabe, Vautrin, and other witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming: photographs, diary entries, surgical records. Eyewitness testimony from multiple international observers who had no reason to lie. General Iwane Matsui, who commanded Japanese forces during the Nanking assault, was found guilty of war crimes and executed in 1948. But the broader truth was suppressed. The United States wanted Japan as an ally in the emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union. Dwelling on Japanese war crimes was politically inconvenient. Better to focus on rebuilding Japan as a democratic bulwark against communism. Emperor Hirohito, who bore ultimate responsibility as commander-in-chief of Japanese forces, was never prosecuted. The U.S. occupation authorities granted him immunity in exchange for cooperation with occupation policies. Most officers who participated in or authorized the Nanking atrocities were never charged. They returned to civilian life, some becoming prominent politicians and businessmen in post-war Japan. The Japanese government's official position evolved into denial and minimization. School textbooks describe the Nanking incident in vague terms, if at all. The death toll was disputed. The systematic nature of the rapes was questioned. By the 1970s, Japanese nationalist historians were claiming the Nanking Massacre was Chinese propaganda, that it never happened or was wildly exaggerated. Dr. Wilson spent his later years trying to correct the record. He gave interviews. He published his diary. He testified at historical conferences. Few people listened. The world had moved on. World War II was history. Japan was an ally. China was communist. The political dynamics made it easier to forget Nanking than to confront what had happened there. Robert Wilson died in 1967 at age 66. His obituary mentioned his medical career and missionary work. It didn't mention Nanking. Minnie Vautrin never recovered from what she witnessed. She suffered severe depression and eventually committed suicide in 1941 by turning on the gas in her apartment. She left a note apologizing for being weak, for not saving more women, for failing. John Rabe returned to Germany and tried to inform Nazi leadership about Japanese atrocities. He was arrested by the Gestapo for spreading defeatist propaganda and told never to speak about Nanking again. He died in poverty in 1950, his diary hidden by his family until 1996. The truth about Nanking remained suppressed for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s that serious historical research began to document the full scope of the massacre. Chinese historians started compiling survivor testimonies. Japanese historians began investigating military records. International scholars analyzed the evidence. Iris Chang's 1997 book, The Rape of Nanking, brought the story to global attention for the first time since 1945. The book documented the atrocities in detail, drawing on Wilson's records, Rabe's diary, and hundreds of survivor testimonies. The book was controversial. Japanese nationalist groups condemned it as anti-Japanese propaganda. The Japanese government refused to acknowledge the death toll figures. History textbook publishers continued to minimize the massacre, but the evidence was undeniable. Photographs of mass executions existed. Western eyewitness accounts corroborated each other. Japanese soldiers' own diaries described the killings. In 2015, documents related to the Nanking Massacre were inscribed in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register, officially recognizing the historical significance of the atrocity. Japan protested the UNESCO decision and threatened to withdraw funding. The political fight over Nanking's history continues. Every few years, Japanese politicians visit the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors convicted war criminals alongside other war dead. China protests. International tensions rise. Then both sides move on until the next incident. Meanwhile, the last survivors are dying. In 2017, the final survivor of Wilson's hospital, a woman who had been raped at age 13 and treated by Wilson for internal injuries, died at age 93. She had spent 80 years living with the trauma, speaking at schools and museums, trying to ensure the world remembered. With her death, the number of living Nanking Massacre survivors dropped below 100. Most are in their 90s. Within a decade, all will be gone. The physical evidence is disappearing too. The mass graves have been built over. The execution sites are parks and shopping centers. The hospital where Wilson performed 600 surgeries is a modern medical complex with no memorial to what happened there in 1937-38. History is being erased by time and political convenience. But Dr. Robert Wilson's surgical records survive. His diary survives. The photographs survive. The testimony survives. 300,000 people died in Nanking between December 1937 and February 1938. They were executed in mass graves. They were beheaded in killing contests. They were raped and murdered. They were used as bayonet practice. They were tortured for entertainment. They died while one American surgeon tried to save them, operating 20 hours a day, documenting the nightmare, believing that testimony would matter. It took 60 years for the world to listen. Even now, the full truth is contested, denied, minimized by those who find it inconvenient. But the evidence exists. The records survive. The truth is documented. 300,000 people died screaming in Nanking while the world looked away. The least we can do is remember their names. The least we can do is refuse to let history be erased. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the historical truths that powerful people want forgotten. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This history is uncomfortable. It's disputed, it's denied by some, but it's true, and it matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering Nanking. Thank you for refusing to let 300,000 deaths be erased from history.